So here's one for you. What is the spirituality of politics? Some people are probably thinking, I don't see any, thank you very much. Or maybe you're thinking, 6 days a week, all I hear is politics, politics, politics. Don't we get a Sabbath from that, for God's sake, literally? Sorry. See, the thing is, spirituality is not just something ethereal, mystical, mountaintop. Spirituality is really about how we live our lives, how we live with each other. Politics is definitely an expression of that. Jesus would go up on the mountaintop and pray all night, pray all day. But when he came down, he argued with lawyers and criticized the government. Scripture is actually full of the discussion of the spirituality of politics. Just don't see it most of the time. For example, in today's reading, now concerning food sacrificed to idols. Well, that's pretty abrupt. What has food sacrificed to idols got to do with anything? Why are we still reading that in church? Actually, it's surprisingly relevant. So, apparently, in first century Corinth, you go to the marketplace to buy some meat, and it may have already been consecrated to some pagan deity. Probably kind of similar to being blessed by a rabbi to be kosher or made halal or something like that. So an Orthodox Jew would not buy that meat because it just smacks of paganism. And apparently a newly minted Christian would also feel like, don't touch that meat, that's pagan stuff. But some people are saying, hey, wait a minute, we know better than that. There's only one God. Something dedicated to an idol that means nothing. Food is food. Go ahead and eat it. And someone else is saying, don't say that. That offends me. That offends my conscience. I'm not comfortable doing that. And Paul is saying, well, listen. You got to meet people where they are. Right? Maybe you do have a superior knowledge, a deeper understanding. Maybe you know what really is right. You want to raise someone up to your level? You've got to start not by offending them, but by meeting them where they are. Boy, all week long, how often do I see some bit of news, and the first thing I think is, how could they believe that? How could people think that? What's going on? This is crazy talk. Right? And how quick we can be to come to judgments even before you hear what anyone says. Tell me what state you grew up in. I'll tell you everything else about you. Get so attached to labels. Back when it was a little bit easier for some people to talk about politics, this guy asked his friend, he said, the election's coming up, so what are you thinking? You're going to vote Republican or Democrat? And his friend said, I'm voting Democrat. I always vote Democrat. My father voted Democrat. His father voted Democrat. My great-grandfather voted Democrat. The other guy said, that's pretty twisted logic there, don't you think? I mean, so what if your father were a horse thief, and your grandfather was a horse thief, and your great-grandfather was a horse thief? Well, what would that make you then? He said, oh, well, that would make me a Republican. Silly labels, right? Silly stuff. The issues at stake are very serious and real. This is not to belittle the issues. Democracy, civil rights. The thing is, we take it all so personally and feel personally threatened and offended by everything that it just turns into a shouting match in no time. No hope of progress. Meet people where they are, says Paul. Good point. How do we do that? Maybe the first thing we ought to do is acknowledge that we're already way off the rails. We're all really way off the rails. We have been for a long time, maybe always. I mean, we accept, for example, that all economic growth must be a good in itself, without asking what the actual cost is, or the consequences, or even the purpose. We consume things because we can. We don't think if we need them or if they're quality. We quibble about all these superficial things, and meanwhile the earth that sustains life is dying. That's a sin. Start by acknowledging that we're all way off the rails and in this together. And that there's no quick fix. It doesn't fix it to just change the players. Look at what happened in the gospel today. Jesus is teaching in the synagogue, and someone who comes in who, through our eyes, is maybe mentally ill, or maybe possessed by a demon. Jesus says, unclean spirit out, boom. Sounds like a quick fix, doesn't it? Then what happens? Does the guy go to coffee hour and talk about the Patriots? I mean, is that the end of the story? Or is that the beginning of the real hard work? What is an unclean spirit anyway? Do I have one sometimes? Can I just shake it out in a moment? Or is it going to take some teasing and healing, some work? The gospel is about sacrificing the ego. Sacrificing the ego to build community, not to prove anything right. That's hard work. Knowledge puffs up, says Paul. Love builds up. We probably share a lot more problems, everyone, than we would like to acknowledge. You hear about that guy in Jackman this week, on a town board or whatever the term would be, and he was fired because he was advocating an all-white New England. And a voluntarily all-white New England. It's even more interesting. And he said, by the way, this is not racist. Well, when I read that, my first thought was, this is crazy talk. How is an all-white, voluntarily all-white New England not racist? And what about an all-white community suddenly turns it into a utopia? This is nuts. But we might ask ourselves, what is he afraid of? Maybe he's afraid that the neighborhood's going to change. The old neighborhood I grew up in is not going to be the same. And he's right. How are we doing with that? We're like that in church, right? I mean, I don't want a new hymnal. I like the old one. I don't want a new prayer book. I like the old one. I do. Someone wants a new prayer book. Can't they just go to another church? There was a cartoon going around the internet a while ago of this redneck hillbilly with a shotgun and an Islamic jihadist with an AK-47. And they're facing each other, shouting at each other, threatening to kill each other. And then as they shout, they begin realizing they're shouting the same things at each other. I don't want you in my country. I don't want you in my country. I don't want you telling me what book I have to read and what my kids pray. I don't want you telling me about my kids pray. And then they start listening to each other and it's like, oh, wait a minute. I think that secularism is undermining all of my traditional values. I think that too. Next thing you know, they're hugging and kissing. The kids are all playing together. Who's the enemy? It's a question that maybe we shouldn't be too quick to answer. So Jesus comes to church one day. I love this gospel story. And starts teaching. Doesn't that sound wonderful? just sit here and listen to Jesus teaching? Until some crazy guy comes in and interrupts it all. And then there's all this drama and convulsing on the floor. We're Episcopalian, we don't like that. We don't do that here. What is this story trying to tell us? Well, who do we think we are? In the story, I mean. Who do we think we are in that story? Is it possible that through the eyes of God, we're the crazy guy, saying, "What have you to do with us, Holy One of God?" Could be a good place to start. Amen.